A liberal journalist mocks Nayib Bukele in public. Her astonishing response leaves everyone silent. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. The studio lights shone brightly on the brilliant set of the late-night spotlight program, where Fiona Carrington reigns supreme. Known for her sharp wit and unfiltered progressive stance, Fiona had earned a place on late-night television as a bold voice who challenged politicians, celebrities, and cultural figures with equal intensity. Her audience loved her for it, tuning in nightly to watch her disarm her guests with biting commentary and remorseless sarcasm. During a routine production meeting, one of the producers suggested inviting Nayib Bukele to the show. The room was filled with excitement and skepticism. Bukele, president of El Salvador and an increasingly influential global figure, had been both admired and criticized for his unconventional decisions and disruptive leadership style. Fiona's eyes sparkled at the idea. It was not only an opportunity to increase the audience, but also to oppose what she considered outdated ideals and risky policies, embodied by Bukele himself. Fiona, who never left anything to chance, enthusiastically immersed herself in her research. She played back speeches and interviews of Bukele on her laptop, while jotting down comments in the margins of her script. She couldn't help but smile as she imagined the contrast between his sharp modern wit and the carefree confidence of the Salvadoran president. For her, this wouldn't just be an interview, it would be a duel, and her audience would love it, she thought, visualizing the laughter that would follow her more pointed remarks. Meanwhile, Nayib Bukele was in his presidential office when he received the invitation. Sitting in his office, letter in one hand and coffee in the other, his assistant, a young man named Javier, watched him before speaking. "Are you sure you want to do this, President? Fiona Carrington is not exactly friendly territory," he said cautiously. Bukele smiled slightly, his face serene, showing neither irritation nor concern. Friend or not, a conversation is still a conversation. People can say whatever they want. It doesn't change the truth. Javier was not convinced. He had seen enough of Fiona's interviews to know how relentless she could be. She's going to attack him. She knows that, right? She'll bring up politics, his Bitcoin strategy. They might even talk about his governing style. Bukele shrugged his shoulders. Let him do it. He put the letter down on the desk and looked out the window to the horizon. Sometimes it's not about winning or losing, but simply about showing up. The days leading up to the interview were intense for both sides. Fiona's team carefully prepared their questions, making sure each one was loaded with irony and humor to provoke laughter from the audience. Bukele, for his part, continued with his usual routine, not giving too much importance to the event. He refused to rehearse answers or prepare defenses, relying on his instincts to deal with whatever came his way. When the day of the program arrived, the studio was full of energy. The audience settled in between regular fans and curious onlookers, eager to see how the evening would unfold. Fiona was going over her opening lines backstage, completely confident. In the dressing room, Bukele waited calmly, sipping water and waving politely to the crew. For Fiona, it was just another night of wit and biting remarks. For Bukele, it was a chance to share his vision with an audience that had probably never really heard him before. Neither imagined how much that night would change for both of them in the conversation they would ignite across the country. The energy in the studio was palpable as the audience filled every seat, conversations brimming with anticipation. The set glistened under the lights with its iconic desk, elegant chair, and backdrop of the illuminated city. Fiona Carrington's name glowed on the studio screens, a reminder of the power she wielded as the show's charismatic host. Fiona was in her element, surrounded by her production team and assistants. She reviewed her notes one last time with a satisfied smile. The monologue she had prepared was sharp and accurate, replete with witty banter aimed squarely at Nayib Bukele. "Tonight will be legendary," said Fiona to her head writer, Veronica, who nodded enthusiastically. "No doubt it will be a hit with the audience," Veronica replied. Bukele is the perfect symbol of everything your audience loves to criticize. Just remember to keep it fun. Don't give him too much room to respond. "Please," Fiona joked, adjusting her microphone. "He shouldn't even have time to keep up with me." Meanwhile, Nayib Bukele arrived at the studio without too much fuss. Dressed in an impeccable blazer and jeans, he moved with a quiet confidence that effortlessly commanded attention. His assistant Javier walked behind him, still visibly uneasy about the night ahead of them. "Last chance to change his mind," Javier said as they walked down the hallway toward the dressing room. Bukele laughed softly. "You worry too much. It's just a conversation." Now settled in, Bukele drank water as he watched the opening sequence of the program on the monitor. He heard the cheers as Fiona's name was announced, the sound echoing throughout the building. Javier, unable to sit still, muttered, Look at that crowd. They already have her in the palm of their hand. Bukele looked at the screen, watching as Fiona took the stage with her usual confidence. It's her job, he said simply, leaning back in his chair. Mine is to tell the truth. We'll see what happens out there. Fiona began her monologue, her delivery polished and energetic. She opened with some light banter before moving on to her guests for the evening. Ladies and gentlemen, today we have a legend with us, she began, her tone brimming with sarcasm. Nayib Bukele, an icon of the more, shall we say, eccentric ideas of modern leadership, and the man who thought turning Bitcoin into national currency would be a good idea. The audience erupted in laughter and applause as Fiona smiled, pleased by the reaction. She continued with a series of jokes about Bukele's policies, his economic decisions, and his style of government. From the dressing room, Bukele watched with mild amusement, his expression unperturbed. Javier, uneasy, murmured, "He's being relentless." Bukele barely nodded. "She's doing her job. Let her have her fun." Finally, Fiona introduced Bukele. The applause was mixed, with cheers interspersed with some boos. Fiona extended her hand to him as he came on stage. Bukele shook it firmly, his face calm and serene. He greeted the audience with a gesture that elicited some laughter and scattered applause. "President Bukele, welcome to the program," Fiona began, her tone light but with a mocking tinge. "Thank you for inviting me," Bukele replied, his voice firm. "Nice audience you have here." "You have a lovely audience," Bukele commented with a slight smile, noting the palpable energy in the studio. Fiona leaned forward, eyes sparkling with anticipation. "Oh, of course they do. They love a good debate." "Ready to get started?" "Always," Bukele replied calmly. And so, the verbal duel that everyone had been waiting for officially began. The studio was buzzing with anticipation. Fiona was ready to dominate, while Bukele, serene, knew he had nothing to prove. The difference between their energies was evident. Fiona radiated sharpness and dynamism, while Bukele projected a calm, unwavering confidence that little by little began to make her uncomfortable. "So Nayib," Fiona began with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You've been running the country for several years now, haven't you? That's impressive. Do you ever think that maybe it's time to let the younger generation take over?" The audience let out a chuckle, clearly on Fiona's side. Bukele tilted his head slightly, considering the question. "Well, Fiona," he said in a calm voice, "I've always believed that it's not about age, it's about what you bring to the table. If you have valuable ideas and the determination to execute them, why stop?" His calm response drew some polite applause from the audience. But Fiona wasn't finished. "Sure, but times change, don't they? I mean, many of your policies have been revolutionary, but not everyone would agree that they are, let's say, the most conventional. Don't you feel that some of those methods you apply no longer fit in today's world?" The audience erupted in laughter and applause, delighted with the pointed observation. Bukele remained unperturbed, leaning back slightly in his chair. "I think it is important to remember," he replied in a firm voice, "that every decision reflects its context. The solutions we apply arise from the specific challenges we face. Sure, some ideas evolve, but that happens in all aspects of life. Progress is about learning from the past, not erasing it." The audience's enthusiasm slowly faded as they digested his words. Sensing the change, Fiona tried to regain control. "Good point," she conceded with a shrug. "But let's talk politics. You've been quite outspoken with your positions over the years, and let's just say they don't always coincide with those of much of this audience. Aren't you worried that being so outspoken might alienate those who once admired you?" Bukele smiled softly, looking Fiona in the eye. "I have always believed in being honest about who I am and what I stand for. If that makes some people uncomfortable, so be it. Integrity isn't about pleasing. It's about standing by your principles, even when it's not in your best interest." A murmur ran through the audience, a mixture of agreement and skepticism. Fiona, determined to keep the upper hand, leaned in a little closer. "But don't you think that stubbornness might make him look disconnected?" she asked, feigning concern. "The world is moving on, and some would say you are clinging too much to the past." Bukele let out a soft laugh with an amused twinkle in his eye. "You call it clinging, I call it keeping your feet on the ground. The world moves fast, Fiona, but sometimes, in its haste to change, it forgets the value of what came before." The studio was silent for a moment, struck by the simplicity and clarity of his words. Fiona hesitated, noticing that the audience's attention was beginning to waver. "That's fine," she said after a brief pause, her tone lighter. "But surely you admit that there is always room for improvement in how things have been done." "Of course," Bukele replied without hesitation. There is always room for improvement, but improvement does not mean destroying the foundations. It's about building on them. You can't write a new chapter if you keep tearing out the previous pages. The audience, which previously celebrated Fiona's comments with enthusiasm, was now silent, reflecting. Even Fiona, who prided herself on her verbal agility, was speechless for a moment. The exchange continued. Fiona threw sharp questions, and Bukele responded calmly and precisely. The contrast between the two was remarkable. She played with provocation, he with conviction. And little by little, the balance on stage began to shift. The audience, which at first was clearly on Fiona's side, began to see Bukele from another perspective. By the end of the segment, Fiona's attempts at humor seemed forced, while Bukele's authenticity resonated strongly. It was clear that this was no ordinary interview. Although the audience still didn't know which side to take, they couldn't help but feel a growing respect for the man they had come to criticize. Fiona, trying to regain ground, threw out another sarcasm-laden question, this time accusing him of promoting overly authoritarian leadership ideas with his bold policies. "Let's talk about those radical decisions," she said in a playful but cutting tone. "Do you ever think that such forceful actions, like militarizing prisons or betting on cryptocurrencies, reinforce somewhat dangerous ideas about power?" The audience erupted in laughter and applause at Fiona's well-prepared commentary. She leaned back, enjoying the moment. Bukele, however, did not flinch. He nodded slightly, letting the laughter die down. "Well, Fiona," he replied in a calm, deliberate voice, "I think it's easy to judge the present without looking at the context. These decisions were not born on a whim. They represent responses to real challenges: security, economic independence, justice. If that seems extreme, perhaps it is because we have different definitions of what it means to act courageously." The room fell silent, the laughter and applause replaced by an atmosphere of curiosity. Fiona blinked, surprised by his firm response. She hadn't expected him to face his critics with such conviction. "Well," she said, recovering herself, "that's an interesting perspective. But surely you admit that some measures were too aggressive. Don't you think that sends the wrong message, especially to young people?" Bukele leaned forward slightly, clasping his hands together. "Adversity is part of life, Fiona. It always has been. But our decisions do not seek to glorify it, but to confront it. They are hard actions for hard times. Life is not simple, and sometimes you have to face the difficult to protect what really matters." The weight of his words silenced the audience, many of whom began to nod. Sensing the turn, Fiona decided to change the subject. "All right," she said with a forced smile, "but let's leave the past behind and talk about the present. You've been very outspoken about your political views, some of them quite controversial by all accounts. Do you think that has affected your legacy? That it has alienated followers who once admired you?" Fiona asked, leaning toward him with intent. Bukele leaned back in his chair, thoughtful but unconcerned. "Maybe so," he admitted, "but I have never been interested in being popular, Fiona. I'm interested in being honest. You can't please everyone, and if you try, you end up losing yourself. My ideas don't seek to make everyone happy. They seek to reflect what I think is right, and that's all any of us can do." For a moment, Fiona hesitated. Her usual strategy of spinning her guest's words was not working. Bukele wasn't defending himself or getting upset. He was responding with a quiet sincerity that was beginning to win over the audience. Determined to take a chance, Fiona leaned in even closer. "You seem quite comfortable with who you are," she said, softening her tone. "But don't you think there is value in evolving, in letting go of old ideas and embracing new ones?" Bukele's eyes met his, firm and unwavering. "Of course there is," he replied. "But evolving doesn't mean abandoning your roots. It means understanding them, learning from them, and taking with you what is really worthwhile. The problem today is that too many people want to destroy everything without thinking about what they are building instead." The silence that followed was profound. Even Fiona, used to dominating the conversation, was speechless. Bukele's words hung in the air, resonating loudly with the audience. Sensing it, Bukele looked at the audience, softening his expression. "I understand," he said. "I am young to some, but to others, my ideas seem old-fashioned. But life is not about being right all the time. It's about being true to yourself, even when it's hard. And it's about listening, even when you disagree." A young woman in the front row discreetly wiped away a tear. The audience, which had previously laughed and applauded with ease, now fell into contemplative silence. Even Fiona seemed momentarily moved, her usual assurance replaced by mild introspection. "Do you mind if I tell a little story?" Bukele asked, breaking the silence like a hot knife through butter. Fiona hesitated, then nodded. "Go ahead," she replied, now with a softer tone. And as Bukele began to speak, the dynamic in the studio changed completely. What began as a verbal duel turned into something much deeper, a conversation that would mark everyone in the room, including Fiona. Bukele leaned forward slightly, his face calm but reflective. The audience drew closer, sensing that something important was about to happen. Fiona, less defiant, watched him intently, not knowing what to expect. You know, many people look at the present and think it was always easy to get here. But El Salvador has not been kind to anyone, especially to a young man like me who did not come from traditional politics, who did not have a famous last name or godfathers behind him. The audience let out a small laugh, surprised by her unexpected humility. Fiona raised an eyebrow, intrigued. When I started, I was nobody. I had small businesses, personal projects, huge dreams, and many closed doors. There were those who told me I wouldn't make it, that it was impossible to change a country like ours, that it was better not to try. Silence filled the room, everyone attentive to every word. I could have given up, Bukele continued, his gaze sweeping the audience. Most would have, but I didn't. Not because I thought I would become president in it, but because something in me told me to keep going. I worked harder. I learned from every mistake, every rejection. I watched, I listened, I prepared. And when opportunities didn't come, I didn't wait. I created new ways to move forward. Fiona, ready to interrupt with another question, held back. There was sincerity in Bukele's voice that disarmed any defense. And one day the opportunity came, he said with a slight smile. I was given the confidence to lead a city. It was no big deal to some, but to me it was everything. It was my chance to show that we could do things differently, so I gave it my all. He paused, staring blankly for a moment, as if reliving those early days. The funny thing about opportunities is that they bring no guarantees. They give you a door, but it's up to you to decide what to do when you walk through it. I worked harder than ever, not for fame or money, but out of respect for the opportunity I had been given. And little by little, things began to change. I learned, I grew, I got better. Sensing the turn, Fiona decided to change the subject. All right, she said with a forced smile, but let's leave the past behind and talk about the present. You've been very outspoken about your political views, some of them quite controversial by all accounts. Do you think that has affected your legacy? That it has alienated followers who once admired you? Fiona asked, leaning toward him with intent. Bukele leaned back in his chair, thoughtful but unconcerned. Maybe so, he admitted. But I have never been interested in being popular, Fiona. I'm interested in being honest. You can't please everyone, and if you try, you end up losing yourself. My ideas don't seek to make everyone happy. They seek to reflect what I think is right, and that's all any of us can do. For a moment, Fiona hesitated. Her usual strategy of spinning her guest's words was not working. Bukele wasn't defending himself or getting upset. He was responding with a quiet sincerity that was beginning to win over the audience. Determined to take a chance, Fiona leaned in even closer. You seem quite comfortable with who you are, she said, softening her tone. But don't you think there is value in evolving, in letting go of old ideas and embracing new ones? Bukele's eyes met his, firm and unwavering. Of course there is, he replied. But evolving doesn't mean abandoning your roots. It means understanding them, learning from them, and taking with you what is really worthwhile. The problem today is that too many people want to destroy everything without thinking about what they are building instead. The silence that followed was profound. Even Fiona, used to dominating the conversation, was speechless. Bukele's words hung in the air, resonating loudly with the audience. Sensing it, Bukele looked at the audience, softening his expression. I understand, and he said, I am young to some, but to others, my ideas seem old-fashioned. But life is not about being right all the time. It's about being true to yourself, even when it's hard. And it's about listening, even when you disagree. A young woman in the front row discreetly wiped away a tear. The audience, which had previously laughed and applauded with ease, now fell into contemplative silence. Even Fiona seemed momentarily moved, her usual assurance replaced by mild introspection. Do you mind if I tell a little story? Bukele asked, breaking the silence like a hot knife through butter. Fiona hesitated, then nodded. Go ahead, she replied, now with a softer tone. And as Bukele began to speak, the dynamic in the studio changed completely. What began as a verbal duel turned into something much deeper, a conversation that would mark everyone in the room, including Fiona. Bukele leaned forward slightly, his face calm but reflective. The audience drew closer, sensing that something important was about to happen. Fiona, less defiant, watched him intently, not knowing what to expect. You know, many people look at the present and think it was always easy to get here. But El Salvador has not been kind to anyone, especially to a young man like me who did not come from traditional politics, who did not have a famous last name or godfathers behind him. The audience let out a small laugh, surprised by her unexpected humility. Fiona raised an eyebrow, intrigued. When I started, I was nobody. I had small businesses, personal projects, huge dreams, and many closed doors. There were those who told me I wouldn't make it, that it was impossible to change a country like ours, that it was better not to try. Silence filled the room, everyone attentive to every word. I could have given up, Bukele continued, his gaze sweeping the audience. Most would have, but I didn't. Not because I thought I would become president, but because something inside me told me to keep going. I worked harder. I learned from every mistake, every rejection. I watched, I listened, I prepared. And when opportunities didn't come, I didn't wait. I created new ways to move forward. Fiona, ready to interrupt with another question, held back. There was sincerity in Bukele's voice that disarmed any defense. And one day the opportunity came, he said with a slight smile. I was given the confidence to lead a city. It was no big deal to some, but to me it was everything. It was my chance to show that we could do things differently. So I gave it my all. He paused, staring blankly for a moment, as if reliving those early days. The funny thing about opportunities is that they bring no guarantees. They give you a door, but it's up to you to decide what to do when you walk through it. I worked harder than ever, not for fame or money, but out of respect for the opportunity I had been given. And little by little, things began to change. I learned, I grew, I got better. But that comes at a cost, don't you think? Staying true to yourself is admirable, sure, but what about the opportunities you miss? The people who walk away? Don't you get lonely sometimes? Bukele took a second before answering. There is always a cost, he admitted, but losing yourself costs a lot more. I have seen too many people, both in politics and in life, give up parts of themselves just to fit in, to be liked, to succeed. And they may get what they were looking for at first, but over time, they become empty. Because when you lose your integrity, you lose what really defines you. The studio fell dead silent. The words were resonating deeply. Fiona nodded slowly, understanding the weight of what he was saying. Can you give us an example? She asked, now in a soft voice. Bukele clasped his hands together, leaning forward slightly. There was a time, at the beginning of my career, he began, when I was offered an important position. A position that would have given me exposure and recognition. But the project they wanted me to lead went against everything I believed in. I needed the money. I wanted the visibility. But something inside me told me, this is not right, and I turned it down. Fiona raised an eyebrow. And how did that decision go? Bukele smiled slightly. Not very well at first, he confessed. I had a hard time after that, but eventually another opportunity came along, one that did align with my principle. And because I stayed true to myself, I was ready to take it. If I had accepted that first position, I might have won fast, but I wouldn't have been proud of what I brought to the world. And that, to me, matters. The audience, which had at first celebrated Fiona's jokes, now listened with absolute respect. Bukele's words were not just reminders. They were a lesson in the importance of standing your ground, even when it's hard. But the political world doesn't exactly reward integrity, Fiona commented after a pause with a skeptical tinge. Don't you think that kind of idealism is outdated? Bukele leaned back calmly but firmly. Maybe it is, he replied, but that doesn't make it any less important. Integrity is not about being rewarded. It's about being able to look in the mirror and say, I did the right thing. And that doesn't go out of style. That's timeless. A young woman in the audience wiped away a tear. A man in the back nodded, reflective. Bukele's words weren't just reaching, they were awakening something deeper. Fiona settled back in her seat, feeling the weight of the moment. He never seems to have doubted his decisions. She tried to regain control. But I'm sure there were times when you wondered if it was worth it. Of course, Bukele answered without hesitation. I am human, Fiona. I've had doubts, moments when I wondered if I was being too idealistic. But each time I faced those doubts, I remembered why I started. I remembered that success without integrity is not real success. It's just an illusion, and that always put me back on track. The audience burst into applause. It was not the boisterous applause of the beginning of the program, but a deeper, more sincere applause. Bukele nodded softly, grateful but serene. Fiona looked at the audience, aware of the change that had occurred in the room. What began as a lighthearted interview with hints of mockery had transformed into a powerful reflection on integrity and self-respect. When the applause stopped, Fiona turned to Bukele. I must admit, she said in a genuine tone, you have given us a lot to think about. Bukele smiled slightly. That's all I hope, he replied. Life is not about convincing everyone. It's about planting seeds and letting everyone decide. If my words help someone along the way, That's enough for me. The cameras focused on his serene face. The moment seemed almost sacred, a rare pause in the frenetic speed of late-night television. The audience, which at first was ready to question the Salvadoran president, now looked on in admiration. The atmosphere in the studio was no longer the same. What began as a night charged with energy and expectations had transformed into something more intimate, more profound. As the interview continued, Bukele's calm and sincere words had achieved the unthinkable. They had completely captured an audience that was initially not on his side. Even Fiona felt it. You know, Bukele said, breaking the silence after a particularly emotional moment, it's easy to get caught up in the noise. The world is noisy these days. Opinions everywhere. Everyone shouts to be heard. But the truth is usually found in the moments of silence when no one is looking. The audience stood still, captivated by the weight of his words. Fiona, who usually responded with wit, paused, letting her words sink in. She watched the camera crew, more focused than ever, capturing every nuance of the moment. I've been in a lot of noisy rooms, Bukele continued. Political meetings, public debates, international conferences. And you know what I learned? Noise doesn't mean content. The loudest voice is not always the one you should listen to. Sometimes it's the quiet ones that have the most to say. Fiona settled back in her chair, feeling the weight of each word. For years, she had believed that the important thing was to be the loudest voice, to dominate the conversation, to challenge anyone who thought differently. But now, in front of Bukele, he felt a little doubt. Had he really been listening? Or was he just waiting for his turn to speak? President, he said after a pause in a softer tone, do you think the world has become too noisy, too divided? Bukele smiled slightly, leaning back in his chair. I think the world has always been divided, Fiona, he replied. It's just that now we hear it more, thanks to technology, social media, 24/7 news. Everybody's got a microphone. Everybody's talking. But the question is not about the noise. It's about what do we do with it? Do we amplify it, or do we try to make sense of it? The audience murmured softly, processing each word. What about you? Fiona asked, now genuinely curious. How do you deal with all that noise? You are criticized for your ideas, for your decisions, even for your age. How do you deal with it? Bukele's expression softened, and for a moment, he looked almost melancholic. Simple, he replied. I don't let him in. The world can say what it wants about you, but at the end of the day, the only voice that really matters is ours. If you start letting other people's opinions define who you are, you lose yourself. And once you get lost, it's very hard to find yourself again. A young woman in the front row discreetly wiped away a tear, her face reflecting admiration and introspection. A middle-aged man in the back nodded with his arms folded, thoughtfully. The audience, which at first had been eager to laugh at Fiona's jokes, now held absolute respect. Fiona glanced at her notes, but they suddenly seemed irrelevant. She closed the folder quietly and leaned over to Bukele, looking him straight in the eye. He has lived through different times, she said. El Salvador has changed. The world has changed. Do you think we are going in the right direction? Bukele took a moment to think, his gaze serene. I think progress is important, he said, but progress without reflection can be dangerous. You have to know where you came from to understand where you are going, and sometimes in our haste to move forward, we forget to look back and learn from the past. The studio was absolutely silent. Only the faint hum of the cameras could be heard. Fiona, who usually carried the conversation with agility, let the moment linger. The audience seemed mesmerized, gripped by the power of her words. Look, Bukele added, his voice firm but kind, I am not here to tell anyone how to live their life, but I will say this. Don't let the noise muffle your own voice. Don't let the world rush you into making decisions you are not yet ready for. And don't be afraid to stop for a moment. Think, feel, listen. That is where you will find clarity. The applause began timidly, almost hesitantly, before growing louder and more sincere. It wasn't the loud applause of an amused audience, but the heartfelt response of people moved by something real. Fiona leaned back, watching the audience with a thoughtful expression. When the applause stopped, she turned to Bukele. I'll be honest, she said in a softer tone. I came into this interview thinking I would be the one asking the tough questions, but you've made me think of things I didn't expect. Bukele smiled slightly. That's the beauty of a good conversation, he replied. It's not about winning or losing, it's about learning. The cameras panned the audience, capturing their faces, some smiling, others wiping their eyes, several in silent contemplation. The energy in the studio had completely changed, transformed by Bukele's serenity and the undeniable truth of his words. Fiona looked at her producer, who indicated that the segment was about to end. She turned to Bukele with a new admiration in her voice. "Thank you," she said simply, "for sharing your story and for reminding us that sometimes the moments of silence are the ones that matter most." Bukele nodded, raising his hand slightly as if in greeting. "Thank you for inviting me, Fiona. It was my pleasure." And as the cameras cut to commercials, the studio remained silent. The weight of his words still hung in the air, even after he had stopped speaking. When the cameras were completely turned off, the atmosphere had changed. The usual hustle and bustle of the end of the program was absent. Instead, a reflective silence filled the room. The audience began to rise from their seats. Some murmured softly among themselves. Others still seemed lost in thought. Fiona remained at her desk, motionless for a moment, staring at her notes. The biting questions she had so carefully prepared now seemed empty and meaningless to her. She looked up and watched Bukele, who was slowly rising from his chair, his movements calm and confident. He turned to the audience, raised his hand once again, and received a final round of applause, accompanied by gestures of respect. As Bukele left the stage and headed backstage, crew members and producers approached him, this time with admiration rather than skepticism. A young cameraman, fresh out of college, held out his hand nervously. "President Bukele," he said in a shaky voice, "I just wanted to thank you. What you said tonight really touched me." Bukele gave him a small smile and a firm but warm handshake. "I'm glad to hear it, son. Life is about finding what really matters and holding on to it. Don't let the world tell you otherwise." Meanwhile, Fiona retreated to her dressing room, her mind spinning. The program hadn't gone as planned. It had been something completely different, something she never anticipated. For years, she had prided herself on her ability to master interviews and disarm the most difficult guests. But that night had been different. She had been disarmed. She closed the door to her dressing room and dropped into the chair in front of the mirror. She looked at her reflection. Her makeup was still flawless under the lights, but her expression told a different story. She felt exposed, as if Bukele's words had removed layers she didn't even know existed. Was she listening? She whispered to herself. The question hung in the air, as simple as it was disturbing. Backstage, Bukele was gathering his things when Fiona's producer, Veronica, approached him. Her usual confidence seemed to have vanished. "President Bukele," she began in a soft voice, "I just wanted to tell you that was incredible. I don't think we've ever had a guest who could capture the attention of the room like you." Bukele let out a small, humble laugh. "I wasn't trying to capture anything," he replied. "I just spoke my truth. People listen when they are ready to listen." Veronica nodded, showing respect. She left us all with a lot to think about. As he left the studio, his assistant Javier was waiting for him by the car. His expression was a mixture of relief and admiration. "I must say, President," he said as he opened the door for him, "I wasn't sure how this would go, but you handled it like a master." Bukele settled back in his seat and took one last look at the studio. "It's not about handling it, Javier," he replied. "It's about being yourself. The rest comes on its own." The ride back was silent. The city lights cast long shadows on the streets. Bukele looked out the window, serene but thoughtful. He didn't usually stop to think too much about the moments he had experienced, but even he knew that night had been different. The next morning, clips of the interview flooded social media. People from all walks of life shared their opinions. Some praised Bukele's wisdom, others criticized Fiona's initial approach. But the general sentiment was clear: respect. Respect for Bukele's authenticity and for the unexpected depth of that conversation. Bukele's words resonated deeply, connecting with the personal experiences of many. Fiona's show, known for its humor and sharp commentary, was now a topic of conversation for entirely different reasons. Back in her apartment, Fiona read the comments on social media. Some praised Bukele, others criticized her handling of the interview. She leaned back in her chair, mentally reviewing every moment of the encounter. For the first time in his career, he doubted, not of her talent or her ability, but of her approach. Bukele's words had forced her to confront a question she had avoided for years. Was she using her platform to truly connect or just to dominate? The thought hovered as she opened her computer. She began typing a statement, a rare thing for her to do after an episode. Last night's conversation with Nayib Bukele reminded me of the power of listening. Thank you, President Bukele, for sharing your wisdom and perspective. It gave us a lot to think about. He posted the message and let out a long sigh. For Bukele, the day went on like any other. He returned to his usual routine, unconcerned about the commotion the interview had caused. He had said what he had to say, and that was enough. But for Fiona, that conversation marked a before and after. A moment that stuck with her, changing not only the way she saw her career, but also the way she understood the world. And for the audience, that night was more than entertainment. It was a reminder that, amidst all the noise, integrity, and truth still have the power to touch hearts and transform minds. The days following Nayib Bukele's appearance on Spotlight were like no other in Fiona Carrington's career. The episode went viral, shared across all platforms, not because of the jokes or Fiona's trademark wit, but because of the honesty and emotional depth Bukele brought to the conversation. The internet was full of reactions, analysis, and commentary on the unexpectedness of the moment. Social networks, so often a battleground of polarized opinions, showed something rare: respect. People of different ages, ideologies, and countries praised Bukele's serenity and wisdom. A clip in which he said, "Integrity is not about being popular, but about being able to live with yourself," reached millions of views in a few days, becoming a motto for those yearning for authenticity in a world increasingly consumed by appearances. Fiona, meanwhile, was facing a wave of introspection. From her office, she sifted through the hundreds of comments. Some criticized her for her initial attitude. Others noted how Bukele had changed the dynamics of the program. The criticisms hurt, yes, but even more shocking to her was the obvious transformation he had brought about in both her and the audience. For years, she had prided herself on being an incisive and sharp presenter. Now she wondered if she hadn't been too focused on winning debates, forgetting the most important thing: really listening. Veronica, her producer, knocked gently on the door and entered. "Have you seen the numbers?" she asked, holding up a tablet with the episode's record numbers. Fiona nodded, distracted. "Yes, I saw them. This is a success, Fiona. People are talking about the show like never before. It wasn't the usual laugh show, but maybe that's not a bad thing." Fiona looked up, thoughtful. "It was more than different," she said quietly. "It was real. And it wasn't because of me. It was because of him." She sighed, leaning against the back of the chair. "He didn't defend himself with sarcasm or evasiveness. He made me think. He made us all think. And I wasn't prepared for that." Veronica smiled slightly. "Maybe we need more guests like that. People to challenge us." Fiona nodded, her mind already spinning. He had spent so much time perfecting the art of breaking down defenses and pointing out errors that he had forgotten what it was like to really listen. Bukele didn't counterattack with witty or aggressive phrases. He simply spoke with sincerity, and that completely changed the conversation. For Bukele, the subsequent impact was quieter, but just as significant. Back at his farm, he resumed his routine, working with his hands, enjoying the calm and reflecting on the little things that really matter. When Javier, his assistant, showed him the articles and headlines praising the interview, Bukele just smiled. "It looks like you broke the internet, President," Javier commented, scrolling through the news. "They say it was one of the most powerful interviews of the year." Bukele shrugged his shoulders, amused. "It's funny how the simplest thing generates the most noise." "I wasn't trying to break anything, Javier. I just said what I felt I had to say." Javier laughed. "Well, it worked. People say it was a master class in authenticity." "Authenticity," Bukele repeated with a soft smile. How rare that seems to be these days. But the impact was not just in headlines and networks. The interview generated real conversation. In homes, offices, and schools, people debated resilience, integrity, and the value of listening. A teacher in a small town played a clip of the interview to his students, sparking a discussion about values and perseverance. A young entrepreneur in Los Angeles recounted that Bukele's words inspired him to turn down a $1 million contract that did not align with his principles. Bukele's words went further than he imagined. Fiona was not immune either. Weeks later, she opened her program with an unexpected confession. "Before introducing our guest," she said in an unusually serious tone, "I want to talk about something that I have not been able to get out of my mind since the last interview with Nayib Bukele." That conversation was not just another one. It was a wake-up call. It reminded me and all of us of the importance of listening, of being present, and of being true to who we are. And I want to thank him for that. The audience, surprised but moved, responded with warm applause. It wasn't the kind of brilliant, provocative moment Fiona was known for, but it was real, and that was enough. Nayib Bukele's appearance on Spotlight went down in television history, not as a viral confrontation, but as a rare and profound moment of connection. A reminder that even in a world saturated with noise and division, there is still room for the quiet strength of integrity and the power of listening. For Fiona, it was a turning point that led her to rethink her role and give her work a more authentic purpose. For Bukele, it was just another day of being true to his principles. And for the audience, it was an indelible lesson, a moment that proved that sometimes the quietest voices are the ones that speak the most powerful truths.